Everything that we do, the way that we see the world, the way that we think about problems has to do with perspective, right? Perspective shapes everything that we do. And my perspective is completely tied to being a musician. So if I'm confronted with a problem that I need to solve, I solve it the same way that I would solve a musical problem, because I've spent so many hours for so many years thinking about how to solve musical problems. Sometimes it's artistic problems, sometimes it's practical problems, like how do I make my hand move in a certain way at a certain speed. And so I am always thinking about music, and I'm always comparing it to other things in my life. I'm also an entrepreneur, and for a while I thought that being a musician and an entrepreneur, they were just two things that I was interested in. They weren't necessarily related. But I started to notice that so many important people were also musicians. We just didn't really know that they were musicians. And I was starting to wonder if there's some kind of connection to that. For instance, I'm willing to bet that you would know most of the names on this list that I'm going to put up, but you probably didn't know that they were all musicians. Important scientists, writers, thought leaders, philosophers, politicians. A lot of these people were musicians. They're not necessarily professional musicians. They're not doing it for a living. But the way that they see the world and the way that they solve problems is shaped by their backgrounds as musicians. So I thought for a while, what are some ways that musicians are thinking about problems that can go into the way that we might pursue other careers? The way that musicians might become a scientist or a thought leader. What are some of the tools that they're taking with them? And is there a way that I could put some of those ideas down for people, if you're a musician or you're not a musician, that anybody can benefit from those kinds of understandings? So that's what I wanted to try to do with this. But we've noticed a problem in the 21st century. In the 21st century, especially with classical music, audiences are having a harder time connecting to what we do, probably for a lot of reasons. But I think there are two reasons in particular. One is that we're constantly being distracted by technology. I say this while I'm holding a piece of technology. But everything is constantly buzzing and vibrating and sending us notifications, and it's always splitting our attention. So it's hard to focus for a long period of time. And the other thing is, I feel like our society maybe has put a little bit less energy into music education, and so we don't have quite the same background and the same kind of context that previous generations maybe had for being able to sit through concerts and understand and appreciate those kinds of things. So I want to demonstrate this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play an excerpt of music for you. It's a relatively famous piece of music, so you may recognize it. If you do recognize it, I'm going to ask that you don't say anything about the piece of music yet. I'll give you an opportunity for that a little bit later. But for now, just listen to it. Right there. So I want you to think for a moment, whether or not you know this piece, just reflect on the listening experience that you had. Did it grab you in some way, or did you find it boring? Did you find it exciting? Did it connect to some kind of emotion? Whatever it may be, just think about that to yourself for a moment, and we'll come back to that. Does anybody happen to know what piece of music this is? It is Mozart. Very good. Do you know which Mozart piece? This is an excerpt from Mozart's Requiem. So Requiem is, you may know, say it one more time?
Sad.
It is sad, yeah, absolutely. Requiem is a Catholic death mass. And so coincidentally, this is the very last piece that Mozart wrote. He was writing this piece, and he left it incomplete. So when he passed away, he didn't have a chance to finish it. But his wife, Constanza, needed the money that he was going to earn from the commission. So she hired Mozart's student, whose name was Franz Xaver Süssmayr, to finish the piece. In the excerpt that we just heard, this is actually Mozart's very last musical moment ever, because we know exactly where Mozart's handwriting stops and where his student Süssmayer's handwriting begins. I'm going to play this piece for you one more time. And this time, when we get to Mozart's final two measures, I'm just going to slowly raise my hand so you can see where that is. And when my hand comes down, that's where Süssmayer's handwriting begins. For me, it sounds like the last exhalation of genius from one of the greatest minds that ever lived on this planet. Anybody have a different listening experience that time?
Yeah.
It's amazing how the context changes our experience. Musicians have been learning this the hard way because as context has disappeared, our audiences have disappeared. And so we can always sit around and say, oh, okay, this is unfortunate, but we could also try to do something about it. And maybe it's an opportunity for us. For many people, this has been going on for a long time. The musicians of the 20th century have tried to give this context, to try to show people the story behind what's happening. The stories make such a big difference. I love to travel, and I'm convinced that when I travel, the food always tastes better. So sometimes the food really is better. You know, pasta in Italy, street food in Thailand, it's very hard to beat those things. But additionally, if I were to eat, let's say, some blueberries, and I eat them in the United States at home, I wash them, I rinse them off, and then I eat them, and that's it. When I'm traveling, I'm much more likely to look at the blueberries and think to myself, is this a new type of blueberry that I'm not used to? When I put it in my mouth, I'm more likely to roll it around on my tongue and feel the texture. So when I'm doing that, I'm creating a different experience. That food is going to taste better to me because I'm creating different contexts. When I come back home and I tell somebody about those blueberries, I'm not just going to say, I have these really good blueberries. I'm going to say, I was in this really remote region in southern France, and the farmer came up to me. There's going to be a story connected to it. When we have these stories, this helps give our audience a different perspective, a different listening experience. I used to work as a consultant for the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, because I have some background in Holocaust music and also with Yiddish musical materials. And a few years ago, I got a phone call from someone at the museum, and they said, could you put something together? We're doing this program. It's for a commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And we want to have some kind of musical element. Now, at the time, I had a very small chamber ensemble of students that I taught at Milken, and so I gave them a piece to learn for this event. And I told my students, you know, the piece that we're going to learn really has absolutely nothing to do with the Holocaust. In its time, it was a very famous Yiddish song, but I think it's important because just about anybody who did live through the Holocaust, there's a very high chance that they know this song from their childhood. And because of the history of what happened with Yiddish language, there's a very high chance that they wouldn't have heard it very much after the Holocaust. So I taught my students this piece. We show up for this event. It's in a very small room, and while it's small, it's packed. There are some dignitaries there, some consul generals, and about 15 to 25% of the room is Holocaust survivors and their families. And so my students go to play this piece, and I look around at the room and I notice one by one, most of these survivors start humming along with this music. It's been so long that I don't think they remember the words, but they remember this tune and they start humming out loud. My students finish this piece. Randy Schoenberg, who was the president of the museum, also the grandson of the great composer Arnold Schoenberg and was recently portrayed in the film The Woman in Gold. He comes up to the podium and he says to everybody, I'm noticing that a lot of you seem to know this tune. Is this something that you guys all know? And the Holocaust survivors, a lot of them answered back, yeah, we know this song. So he said, can we do this one more time? And this time, go ahead and sing out loud if you want to, if you know this song. And something pretty extraordinary happened. My kids played this piece again, and the Holocaust survivors started singing louder, but they don't remember all of the words, of course. And in the audience is Mike Burstyn, who was one of the last child stars of the Yiddish theater. He knows every single word of this song by heart. And he comes up to the podium and he leads all of the Holocaust survivors singing this song. And as I looked around the room, it was just tears streaming down all of their faces. I said to my students, I want you to stick around after this performance because some of these people are going to want to say something to you. I don't know what that thing is, but I want you to stick around. And I stood there long enough to see one of the survivors come up to my student and say, the last time that I heard this song was when my mother sang it to me. And so I walked out of the room and I sat on the floor in the hallway and I just started crying. This is why I have to be a musician, because of the connection that I was able to find. I was able to have my students connect not only with someone 4 generations away from them, but to a 5th generation, to that person's mother who's no longer with us. The wonderful news, the amazing news, is that music is, of course, not the only way to connect with people. We all connect with people in many different ways every single day. And I hope that if anything comes from doing this talk, it's just that I encourage people to try to find that one more opportunity to find a connection, maybe with a loved one or maybe with a complete stranger.